Hey, so let's talk about 5.10, which is urbanization. And let's start with defining what urbanization is. Urbanization is removing vegetation in an area or in an ecosystem to convert the natural landscape to a city or to an urban area. That's, where we get the term urbanization, replacing that urban area. When we replace the natural vegetation, we're removing things like the soil, the vegetation, all the plant life that lives there, the trees, the wetlands, the habitat for organisms. So organisms then are pushed out of the area. And we're replacing all of that with what we call impervious. That's a vocab word that you should know. Impervious surfaces. Impervious surfaces do not allow water to infiltrate or to move into the ground. And so normally, and what those impervious surfaces include are things like concrete, asphalt, or blacktop is the more common name for asphalt, and cement. And so, what happens, as you know, after it rains? I know I can go out in my backyard after a nice rain, and the ground's still kind of squishy, and so that's like a normal thing that's supposed to happen. And then I live on a woods, and so the trees that are there then will soak up that rain, and the plants that I have in my yard, my grasses, even in my yard, soak up all of that rain, and that's a more natural order of things. And so I like this diagram because it really shows you the difference between what the natural area does to an area after a rainfall versus an urban area. And so let's start with this natural area. With the natural area, we end up with 50% of our water not even going into the ground. So approximately 10% of the water is going to become runoff and it's going to move into our waterways, streams, rivers, its ponds, et cetera, et cetera. 40% of the water will actually evaporate. And then what's left over, the other 50%, will actually move into the ground in a natural area. About half of that water will go into like, it'll become deeply infiltrated. So it'll actually move and replenish our groundwater supply. But then about 25% or half of that water that moves into the ground will actually stay fairly shallow and act and water all of the plants and things that are in that area. So that's what happens in a nice, healthy, normal ecosystem when we're talking about the hydrology or the water movement after rainfalls. Okay, or after it precipitates. Here's the issue with an urban area. With an urban area, there ends up only being about 15% infiltration, and you can see our water supplies really take a beating here. Instead of having like a 25% deep infiltration, we're left with just about a 5% deep infiltration. And so the other 10% is just a really shallow infiltration that might water some grass that's there or some trees. Usually, cities try to plant things to make it look nice and a little more green. And then, about this is the real issue of what's happening above the surface. 55% of the water that falls in an urban area actually goes into runoff. So we're really increasing the amount of water that should normally move into the local waterways. And so you can imagine that city engineers and city planners really have to take into account what's going to happen to the water that flows into an area. And they don't always do the best job with that. If you've ever lived in an area where it just floods all the time in an urban area or even a suburban area, it's because they haven't planned well for the hydrology of the area or the new ecosystem that we've created. And then only about 30% of the water actually evaporates back into the atmosphere, which just really messes up our whole hydrologic cycle. Okay, urbanization prevents water recharge, just to kind of reiterate what we've talked about, causing precipitation to run off into these local bodies of water. Another major issue with urbanization, besides this groundwater and hydrology issues that we run into, is that we end up with increased CO2 emissions. And so we do this in a variety of ways. So we know if we look at number three here, this deforestation, I mean, we've already talked about when we urbanize an area, we end up removing all of that vegetation. And so, of course, we're going to be cutting down the trees and the plants that live there. This is not only a loss of immediate carbon, removal from the atmosphere, but it really disrupts the carbon sequestration and the carbon sink that we form or reservoir that we form with our plants. And so this is just a real issue. And then that actually increases the amount of CO2 then that is left in the atmosphere. And then also, when we cut down these trees, CO2 is released through the decomposition of the plant life that's been cut down. And then also, we have CO2 emissions from cement production, from construction machinery that we're using to build the areas. And then also, we need more landfills for disposing of trash from this increasing population, which is also a real concern because now we're using up land in just a not very environmentally friendly way. And so there's a particular issue that occurs in coastal cities that College Board wants you to know. And so we have noticed in the United States, especially, that we're having a large and nearly exponential population growth in our coastal cities. And this can lead to a phenomenon that is called saltwater intrusion. Saltwater intrusion occurs when excessive groundwater withdrawal. So near a coastlines, we end up pushing the groundwater away because we're urbanizing the area. And so we talked about that groundwater is not being absorbed anymore into the ground, it's actually running off. And what this does near coastlines is it lowers the water table pressure in the ground. The water has pressure. The fresh water in the ground creates pressure under the ground that does not allow the salt water along the coast to seep into the groundwater. But now, when we've lowered the water table pressure by removing that excessive groundwater, now what we're doing is we are actually allowing salt water to intrude into our groundwater supplies. So, anyone that lives along the coast and has well water. I know my parents lived in Florida and had a well for their water. um, Now what's happening is the salt water is actually flowing into their wells, and it's reducing the amount of fresh water that we have available for our homes, for our residents that live in those areas. Other issues that arise because of climate change is it's actually twofold when we're talking about the sea and sea levels in particular. The first is that just naturally, as water heats up, we have what we call thermal expansion. Heating molecules, you learned in chemistry, causes them to speed up, and this causes them to spread out. Okay. And so that actually, so the sea level is rising just because the water is getting warmer due to climate change and it's expanding. Thermal expansion is what we call that. And then another issue with climate change is the melting of the ice caps. And so this fresh water is being dumped into this ocean constantly, and it's increasing the volume of the ocean that way as well. So all of this fresh groundwater or fresh water that we have in these sea caps is now becoming contaminated with salt water. And just again, all of this leads can also lead to this saltwater intrusion. So again, it's just a real issue that people don't necessarily think about when they move to the coastlines. Okay, so let's look back to this urbanization topic. Um, Back around the 1960s is where we really saw an change where we had most of our population in the United States living in rural areas. And you can see here that it was over 60%. And then after 1960, we saw a downward trend. And hey, I'm included in this, guys. I was born in 1972 and I grew up in the country. And as soon as I went to school, I moved to, my college campus, which was in the middle of a huge city, and I became an urban dweller. So I'm guilty of this as well. I wanted to be where the action was, right? I wanted to be near my college. I didn't want to have to drive. I walked everywhere and rode my bike and took the city bus, and it was amazing. And so that's one of the things that attracts people to urban areas, having, you know, cultural attractions and entertainment. And in my case, I was moving to college, but many people moved to these areas for jobs as well. And so in the 1960s, though, as this was shifting from more of an rural rural population centers, we now shifted into an urban and then even a suburban um, population centers. And so the urban areas used to be more densely populated, and this was a good thing because for the environment, it was a good thing because it minimized driving and it minimized land use per person. People that live in cities tend to have smaller homes, or they live in apartments or condo buildings. So one big building, it didn't take up very much land and it could house a lot of people. And then people started moving to the suburbs, and that all changed because you move to the suburbs to get a bigger yard, a bigger home. And then when you move to the suburbs, there's not as much, public transportation. And so the highest growth at this time that we're still experiencing into the 2000s is we are now actually even destroying our rural areas, and the rural areas are becoming suburban areas because urbanization is causing a sprawl in our urban centers. And so this is an issue that's called urban sprawl, which is really devastating because it's taking away, it's devastating for the environment. Great for humans. We're getting a lot more services and highways and lots of different things to help us move around. And it makes our economies boom, and we're building infrastructure. But when we think of the environment, it's not necessarily good for the environment. Urban sprawl is causing us to, and suburban sprawl is causing us to tear apart wetlands, create island habitats. We talk about that island biogeography. We're actually creating islands of land where animals can live. And we're noticing issues with coyotes coming into neighborhoods now. Some people where they live, they have a lot of deer moving into the area. Or if you live out west or in Pennsylvania or New York or Michigan, Minnesota, you might have bears moving into urban areas. And so they're doing this because they need places to live too. And so this is a particular environmental issue, this urban sprawl, urbanization that we're experiencing. Okay. And so here is our practice FRQ for this unit. Describe a describe a possible solution to the issue of urban sprawl and identify one possible economic consequence of this solution. Okay, if you have any questions, make sure you talk to me in class, guys.